She said she only needed to sit for 10 minutes, just until her ride showed up. My wife looked at her, then looked at me and nodded like it was nothing. So I stepped aside and let a stranger sit on our porch at 9:40 at night. I remember thinking this was the kind of small kindness people talk about later, the kind that proves you're still a good person. But standing there with the porch light buzzing and my wife already walking back inside, I felt something tighten in my chest, because I realized nobody had asked why she chose our house, and nobody had asked why my wife didn't want her inside. And I didn't know yet that this quiet 10 minutes would stretch into something that never really ended. I'm in my mid-40s, and I've been married for 16 years, the kind of marriage that doesn't fight much and doesn't talk much either. We live in a clean neighborhood where people wave but don't stop, and most nights look exactly the same. Dinner at 7, TV on low, phones in our hands, conversations about groceries or work emails. Nothing broken, nothing exciting, just steady. When the doorbell rang that night, it actually felt unusual. My wife paused the show and looked at me like I should handle it, which I did because that's how things usually go. When I opened the door, there was a woman standing there, about my age, dressed neatly but not comfortably, like she'd been out longer than planned. She smiled too quickly and asked if she could sit for a minute because her ride was late. She pointed vaguely down the street like that explained everything. I hesitated, not because she seemed dangerous, but because the request felt oddly specific. Not asking to come inside, not asking for water, just to sit. I looked back at my wife and she shrugged and said it was fine, but she didn't get up from the couch. She didn't come closer. She didn't ask any questions. She just nodded and went back to her phone. So I stepped outside and told the woman she could sit on the porch chair. She thanked me twice and sat down like she'd already been there before. We didn't talk much at first, just the weather and how quiet the street was. She checked her phone a few times and sighed, and I remember feeling slightly embarrassed, like I was standing guard over a situation I didn't fully understand. After about 10 minutes, my wife cracked the door open and asked if everything was okay. Her tone was neutral, polite, distant. I said yes, and she nodded and closed the door again. And that was the moment something shifted for me, because it felt like I was outside of my own house, making small talk with a stranger, while my wife stayed inside without concern or curiosity. Eventually, the woman stood up and said her ride was close. She thanked me again and walked off without looking back. When I came inside, my wife didn't ask who she was or how long she'd been there. She just restarted the show like the night had gone exactly as planned. And I told myself that was fine, that not every moment needs to be discussed. But lying in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been for something unfamiliar to slip into our routine, and how no one, including me, had tried very hard to stop it. I didn't think about her the next morning, which felt like proof that the whole thing had been nothing. I went to work, answered emails, came home tired, and expected the night to slide back into its usual shape. But when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the porch light was already on, even though it wasn't dark yet. My wife was in the kitchen, moving a little faster than usual, wiping a counter that was already clean. She said hello without looking up, and I didn't ask why the light was on, because asking felt like making a big deal out of something small. Around 9, the doorbell rang again. This time, my wife froze, just for a second, like her body reacted before her mind caught up. I saw it clearly, and before either of us said anything, she told me she would get it. She didn't ask me to, she didn't wait, she just went. I stayed in the living room and listened. The door opened. There was a familiar voice I couldn't place right away. Then the door closed again. My wife came back and said it was the same woman, that her ride was late again, that she'd only be there a few minutes. She said this casually, like she was explaining a delayed package. I asked why she didn't just come inside this time, and my wife said she didn't want to make it a thing, which sounded reasonable but didn't sit right, because nothing becomes a thing unless someone is already thinking about it. I nodded anyway, because nodding has been my default for years. The woman came back 2 nights later, then again the following week. Never inside, always on the porch, always just waiting. I noticed my wife stopped sitting near the window during those times. She'd go upstairs or put headphones on. Once I asked if this bothered her, and she said no too quickly, the kind of no that isn't meant to be examined. Our conversations got shorter without turning cold, like someone quietly turned the volume down. She started going to bed earlier, I started staying up later, and neither of us mentioned the timing. The woman never asked my name, never explained why her rides kept falling through. She didn't look unsafe, she didn't look lost, she looked comfortable, like someone using a routine that worked. One night she thanked me and said some people aren't as kind as they think they are. And I didn't know how to respond to that, because it felt aimed at someone who wasn't there. When I went inside that night, my wife was already asleep, facing the wall, and I stood in the doorway longer than usual, trying to remember when we'd stopped checking in with each other about small things, because it occurred to me that nothing openly wrong had happened, and yet I felt like I was slowly stepping into a role I hadn't agreed to, while my wife quietly stepped out of one she no longer wanted. The truth didn't come out in a fight or a confession. It came out on a Sunday afternoon while we were folding laundry, which somehow made it worse. My wife was matching socks, calm, focused, and she said almost casually that the woman on the porch was someone she met months ago at a support group she never told me about. She said it like it was a scheduling detail I'd missed, not a whole part of her life that existed without me. I asked what kind of support group, and she hesitated long enough that the answer was already there. She said it was for people who felt invisible in their own marriages. And that sentence landed harder than anything dramatic ever could. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't interrupt, because I realized this wasn't a moment, it was a timeline. The woman on the porch wasn't a stranger. She was someone my wife had been talking to regularly, someone she trusted enough to give our address to, someone she felt safer waiting with outside our house than being alone somewhere else. I asked why she didn't come inside, and my wife finally looked at me and said because this wasn't about friendship, it was about escape. She said sometimes they just sat together and didn't talk, sometimes they talked about everything except their spouses, and sometimes they talked about how strange it felt to disappear while still living at home. I asked where I fit into this, and she didn't answer right away, which was the answer. She said she didn't feel like she was allowed to be unhappy because nothing technically was wrong, that I was stable, reliable, kind, and that made her guilt heavier than anger ever could. She said the woman on the porch reminded her that other people felt this way too, that she wasn't broken, just stuck. And I realized then that the discomfort I felt wasn't about boundaries or safety, it was about slowly being excluded from my own marriage, without anything dramatic to point at. No affair, no betrayal you could explain in one sentence, just distance that grew because no one stopped it. I told her that letting someone orbit our home without telling me crossed a line, and she agreed immediately, which almost annoyed me more, because she knew all along, she just chose silence over honesty. She said she didn't know how to talk to me anymore without feeling like she was complaining about a life she was supposed to be grateful for. I told her gratitude isn't the same as happiness, and she nodded like she'd been waiting for permission to hear that. The woman stopped coming after that, not because I asked, but because my wife told her it was time to stop borrowing someone else's house as a pause button. Things didn't magically improve, but they became real again, which was harder and better at the same time. We started having conversations that didn't resolve neatly, pauses that didn't get filled, and silences that actually meant something. I realized that betrayal doesn't always look like cheating or lies. Sometimes it looks like outsourcing your loneliness instead of bringing it home and pretending nothing is wrong because nothing exploded yet. And the scariest part was knowing how easy it would have been to miss entirely if I hadn't answered the door that first night.